Hello. Welcome to the Brisbane Baylands EIR workshop, the second in this series. Tonight will be traffic, air quality, greenhouse gas, and noise. I will go through again what I said before. This document's been a long time in coming, and we all share a great interest in what it says. Before I turn the presentation over to the city's EIR consultant, I have a few reminders and some information about the meeting. First of all, this is an informational presentation. The purpose is for the city's EIR consultant to provide an overview of the EIR, to provide a starting point for those of us who intend to review the document in detail. This is not a formal Planning Commission meeting. While we are pleased to host this presentation, the Planning Commission is here for the same reason as you are this evening, to listen and get some direction in how to review this hefty document. This is not a public meeting to offer comments on the draft EIR, and I will discuss that further. Future steps. After tonight, there will be 2 more informational sessions next Tuesday and next Thursday. The city hopes these serve as a useful stepping stone for the community in reviewing the draft EIR and offering effective and productive comments. The deadline to submit comments is October 8th, 2013. Written comments are strongly encouraged and can be submitted to the city at any time up to the deadline. Public meetings will be held in September to accept public testimony, and we look forward to hearing from everybody at that time. The meeting dates and times are to be determined, and the city will provide those details once they are known. The meeting format. The total time allotted tonight is 90 minutes. Our consultant's presentation will take approximately 1 hour. The remaining 30 minutes will be available for questions regarding the presentation. And please reserve this time for questions about the presentation. As I mentioned earlier, there will be separate opportunities to offer comments on the draft DEIR for public comment, and ultimately public hearings to comment on the project itself. Tonight, we will be accepting 1 question at a time, and then we'll just keep revolving around everyone's to make certain that everyone gets to speak. And then at the end, if there's more questions, we'll try to get them all answered. We appreciate your courtesy and cooperation, and with that, I would like to reintroduce Lloyd Zola of ESA. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I did such a good job yesterday of not keeping track of what's going on behind me. John's going to be doing that tonight. So if I get out of sync with what's there, we're going to look over at John, and it's all his. And it looks like a lot of you, or maybe even most of you, were here last night. And so what I'll do is kind of quickly go through some of the basics to set out the basic document and the process that we're going through. And then we'll start tonight and with the next 2 nights after tonight, going through individual sections of the document. So first we'll talk about CEQA, and I know I have to be careful on all the acronyms because there's going to be a lot of them. California Environmental Quality Act, that's the law that governs the environmental impact report that we'll be talking about tonight, and you'll hear that term, EIR. He's doing great. The EIR, in a lot of communities, will look at that document as being the answer to everything and provide everything we need to know. And really what the information is, this is really just one of the tools that you as a community and you as a planning commission and ultimately the city council will have to make a decision about the project. And I'll describe what that project is. Besides the environmental impact report, which will tell you about the environmental changes that would occur with the project, there is a planning review. Does this fit with our view of what we want the community to be from a planning standpoint? Does this fit with our rules? And then public input from the community. Is this what we want to see for our community? And that will be part of the public hearings that come at the end, the written letters that come in from you on the EIR, and the testimony that will go on. And only after all of that will the Planning Commission and ultimately the City Council make a decision on the Baylands and development of the Baylands. The review that we're going through now is a 120-day period, and that's much longer than the typical 45 days that communities get to review an environmental document. But given that this is 1,200 pages long and is very detailed and it's such a complex project, the City Council determined that a 120-day review period was appropriate, and so that is what we're going through right now. The document that is in front of the community is called a draft environmental impact report. And the reason that it's called a draft is this is the document put out for public comment and comment by public agencies. And it provides an evaluation of environmental impacts. Remember, there's going to also be the planning impacts and planning review that occurs separately, as well as your comments on the project itself. Right now, what this 120-day review period is for is your opportunity to comment on the document. Does this give you the information that you need to make a decision? Does it give you the information you need so that you can, at the end of this review period, go in front of the Planning Commission, go in front of the City Council and say, I like, don't like, because. And this is one of the pieces of information that you will have to give that kind of testimony and ultimately for the Commission and Council to make their decisions. At the end of this 120-day review period, and the reason that you heard we would like written comments, what state law requires is that we provide, and we being the city, provide written responses to every comment, substantive environmental comment that's received regarding the contents of this draft document. And so there will be a set of written responses to the written comments you give, as well as to the verbal comments that you give at those September meetings. We'll just hold the comments to the end, and questions to the end. And so this is all part of these first meetings to give you as the community information to help you make those comments. Now, what this document is intended to do is to provide an analysis of the significance of impacts. And so impact is really defined as the change that occurs in the physical environment. And as we talk about traffic, it will come down to, we know what traffic is today. With a project approval, how does traffic change? What is greenhouse gas emissions? What happens to noise? And we'll talk about those changes from what exists today, and today being under the law, go explain the law sometimes, 2010. And the reason for that is the legal notice that went out to the community regarding the major part of the project was in 2010. So what is being measured are changes from 2010. And the key term and the key determination of all of these impacts is an impact significant? And significant means greater than a predetermined threshold. And what's difficult sometimes is to recognize that significant versus not significant is not a measure of good or bad. One more. It's a measure of, is this greater or lesser than the threshold? And a significant impact requires mitigation. A less than significant impact does not require mitigation. So the basic idea being, if there is no change from existing in any issue, there is no impact. If the impact is less than the specified threshold, less than significant, you will not see mitigation. If the impact is greater than that threshold, as you'll start seeing with traffic and air quality and some of the other impacts we're going to talk about tonight, mitigation is required. Now, that does not mean that a less than significant impact means that's good, because that may or may not be something that you as a community want to see, even if it is less than the threshold. It also does not mean just because there is a significant impact, oh gee, we can't approve anything now because there is a significant impact. State law provides that a community can adopt a project that has significant impacts that cannot be avoided. It also permits a community to deny a project even if there are no significant impacts. So that sense of good and bad as a project is different than is there or are there not significant impacts. So let's talk about the structure of the document, and then we'll get quickly into the project. The document has an introduction that lays out the basic rules, an executive summary that will identify all of the impacts, all of the mitigation measures, and that's on 11 by 17 sheets. A project description that describes all of what is in front of the community to decide on and all the various components of the project. And then an evaluation of impacts and mitigation that I'll show you how it lays out, and alternatives. So not only is the project that's being proposed on the table, there are a series of alternatives, as we talked about last night, to that project that are also being provided in this document, so you can compare how might we change the project to reduce impacts, what other kinds of things can be done on this site, and how does modifying the project affect the level of impacts that we have. And then finally, a discussion of growth inducement, meaning how does this project, what kinds of things might spin off from a project to create growth elsewhere, and then cumulative impacts, how does this all add up when you take development of the Baylands, Hunters Point Shipyard, Candlestick Point, Visitacion, always have to do the Spanish pronunciation, sorry, but the valley and the redevelopment, all of what's proposed in Daly City, when you put that all together, what does that mean? So we're not just looking at the one project. Now we'll talk about individual subjects today, and each of these subjects, traffic, air quality, greenhouse gas, is organized this way. The first part of each section is a description of what is existing, what is the baseline against which we're going to measure impacts. So in terms of traffic, it will say, this is what traffic is on roadways, on the freeway, interchanges. This is transit usage at the baseline. Then it will provide what is the regulatory setting. What are the rules of the game? Both federal rules, and those become very important as we look at other issues where there is federal regulation. What are the state rules? What are the state requirements, regional rules, and we'll talk about some of those as we get into traffic, local regulations. What does your own general plan say about traffic? What does it say about air quality? And then you have significance criteria. And that is that line, remember, above which an impact is significant or below which it's not. And that is the key as to whether mitigation is required or not. And in each section, those are described, and I'll talk about what those specifically are for the subjects we're going to talk about tonight. And then finally, an evaluation of the impacts. What's the change from existing? And what are the mitigation measures for those significant impacts? And then finally, a conclusion. Will those mitigation measures effectively reduce significant impacts to a less than significant level? And are there significant impacts that simply cannot be avoided? So we'll do a quick run through of the project. And the other thing I was supposed to say that I forgot at the beginning, for people watching on television, this is also on the city's website. So if you can't see it on television, you can listen to it on TV, watch, and then run the slide program on the internet. What a world we have. The project itself, the Brisbane Baylands, consists of 733 acres that is mostly within the city of Brisbane, but a portion of the Recology site is in the city of San Francisco. Major landowners are UPC and Recology, and we'll talk about their proposals as we go on. The project and the EIR that you're going to review on the project is called a program EIR. This is not the same as Kaiser proposing to the city of San Leandro, we're going to build a hospital right there and we're going to analyze that hospital, and you have a site plan for it, you know exactly what it's going to look like. What is being done here is an analysis of a set of rules and we'll talk about some of those, and what is intended to be built over a 20-year time frame, and analyzing all of the different actions that would be taken over that 20-year period to approve and build a project. Build real projects, and you'll see the phrase in the EIR, site-specific development. When you see site-specific development, we're talking a building on a site within the Baylands, as opposed to the project, which would be all of these components. And so right now, this program EIR evaluates all of the actions that could occur over that 20-year period, all of the development that could occur under the proposals that are being put forward, and establishes environmental performance standards that must be met in the form of mitigation measures, setting essentially a cap on levels of impact in terms of the impacts as they're evaluated here for those site-specific developments. Then, as individual site-specific developments come through, whether it is in one of the scenarios a recology expansion, whether it's an office building, whether in one of the scenarios it's a residential project, that will require anything that requires a discretionary action, conditional use permit, an amendment to a specific plan, a new specific plan, requires new environmental review. Not necessarily a new EIR, but will require future environmental review of that site-specific development. Is it within the parameters of the program EIR? Is it something else? And there are a set of rules that in state law that govern what is the appropriate form of environmental documentation and under what circumstances would a site-specific project need to do a new EIR, and in what cases they would not. So the project components that we're going to talk about. There is, in the most general level, concept plans, and those are basically land use scenarios, and they are called scenarios in the EIR for the development of the Baylands. There's 4 of them that I'll describe quickly as soon as we get through this. There's a general plan amendment, a proposed change to the city's general plan, because as we talked about last night, all of the scenarios on the table, and we'll talk a little bit in terms of traffic tonight, require changes to your general plan for development of the Baylands. And in the case of traffic, nearly anything you would build, or actually really any development on the site, would require at least one amendment to your general plan. So there is a general plan amendment. There is also the specific plan proposed by UPC that started this process that describes the developer-sponsored plan and the entertainment variant of that. And then 2 site-specific developments. One would be relocation of the lumber yards from one location to another, not expansion, just simply relocation. And then in one of the scenarios, the expansion of the recology site. There is a proposed water supply agreement that we'll be talking about Tuesday night in more detail that would transfer water from the Stanislaus River through a couple different systems to the city of Brisbane that would provide water supply both for the project, development of the Baylands, and build out of the rest of the city. And then there will be an on-site water recycling facility as part of the project. So the 4 scenarios include a developer-sponsored plan. This is part of the specific plan that started the process. It covers 684 acres, not the entirety of the site, because the recology site is not part of the specific plan. It proposes 4,434 dwelling units and about 12 million square feet of building area, obviously open space and the lagoon. The key parts as we get into traffic and air quality will be 4,434 dwelling units and then a total of 12 million square feet of building area. There is an entertainment variant to that specific plan that you will see in the EIR called the DSP-V, Developer Sponsored Plan Entertainment Variant. Same 684 acres, same number of dwelling units, slightly less building area, but it does include a sports arena, 17 to 20,000 seats, a concert hall, more hotel and conference facilities than the developer-sponsored plan, and overall slightly less square footage. You went through a couple years ago a series of meetings that concluded with a community prepared plan and a variant of that. The community prepared plan was 2010 and covers 733 acres. This covers the entirety of the project area. There is no residential proposed in that scenario, and you'll see as we get into issues of traffic and air quality how that plays out in terms of these impacts. And only about 7.6, far less building area, 7.7 million square feet is a lot, but far less total building square footage than you see proposed in the developer's prepared plan. And the fourth scenario is all the same acreage. This is the recology variant, part of that community prepared plan. The basic difference here is an expansion of the recology facility from 250 something thousand square feet to about 1 million square feet, and that occurs up in, you can see the recology site is much bigger than it is in other scenarios, and in that case that would involve a expansion or modernization and expansion of the facility. As we look at the impacts, and our traffic, our noise, our air quality are geared to build out occurring over a 20-year period. And so when we look at impacts of the project in place, we will be using for traffic purposes 2030. We'll look at water supply. Is there a 20-year supply? Remediation of existing contamination at the site would be initiated at the very beginning of the project, because the sites that are now contaminated, obviously remediation must be completed before you can build on them. Construction, the actual pace of construction will be market driven. There is not anything you're going to see in the EIR or in the specific plan or any of these scenarios that say this is the order of development, it will be this much per year, this building, this area goes before this one. As specific as it gets in terms of phasing of the project is it will likely move from west to east, and it's not going to be any more detailed than that. So as we look at construction impacts, those are assumed to be occurring in increments over a 20-year period. The infrastructure, roadways and water, wastewater facilities will all be put in place as part of development, along with that timing of the pace of development. That is the project. So now let's talk about traffic. In terms of traffic, the key issues that the traffic section looks at are the performance of roadways and highways, so vehicular circulation on city streets, on the freeway, at freeway interchanges, and how well do they perform today, and what will be the change in their performance with development of the Baylands as it's proposed under all the four scenarios. It looks at transit. What are the impacts on BART with additional users, on Samtrans, on Caltrain? What are the effects of site development on pedestrian and bicycle systems? All of that is analyzed in this section. Then it looks at safety issues. Are there issues in terms of safety, incompatibility of land uses, emergency access? Can the police department make their way through the site where they need to? Can fire engines get where they need to? Roadway design, are they designed in a manner that will create safety issues? And then a look at air traffic patterns. These are the required topics under state law for a traffic analysis. And then one of the things the city added to that is this section also looks at loading. If there are industrial uses, commercial uses, where are the loading docks? How does that function work in terms of loading? Now, I mentioned significance criteria. Here is the way that we determine in this section, is there or is there not a significant impact? The first one is, will development of the project cause existing performance standards, roadway performance standards, transit performance standards to be exceeded? And I'll talk in terms of, in a second, traffic performance standards, how that's measured, what those are. And then what the standards of BART in terms of how many people can you put in a train. And no, it's not as many as we can stuff in there, it seems like at times. But they actually have standards at what point is a car at capacity. And so we look at their capacity, same for Caltrain. Does this conflict, would development conflict with an applicable congestion management plan? There is a county-wide set of rules about managing traffic congestion and a set of rules that must be complied with. Would there be a change in air traffic patterns that would create substantial safety risks? Would there be hazards due to a design feature or incompatible use? Would this result in inadequate emergency access? Or would it conflict with policies regarding public transit, bikeways, and so on? If those would occur, a significant impact is presumed to exist, and then mitigation to reduce that impact is required. So when you look at those significance criteria, that becomes very important in terms of the determination, is there or is there not an impact? And two primary methods of mitigation are employed in this section. One is physical improvements. Add turn lanes at an intersection, add through lanes, signalize unsignalized intersections where they're just stop signs now. In terms of transit, adding shuttles to and from Caltrain station, adding shuttles to and from BART station, expanding service on Muni. So that is how you increase the capacity of the system. That's one set of mitigation measures. The other way that you have to deal with traffic is reduce the amount of demand. And so we look at transportation demand management. What kinds of things can be done to get people out of their cars onto transit? What do you do when you have the transit overcrowded? But how do we reduce the amount of demand? And when you see, in terms of traffic, significant unavoidable impacts, and there are some here, some impacts that simply cannot be avoided, you then look to, as a community, the alternatives to the project. How might we deal with the project itself and look at our alternatives? How can we reduce those significant unavoidable impacts and ultimately make a decision what is in the best interest of our community? So one of the things you'll see, and I'm not going to read these all, the list that we had is what is called Appendix G of CEQA. So if you want to see the basic statewide significance criteria if you just do a search for California Environmental Quality Act Appendix G, you will see these series of thresholds. And in the case of traffic, they're fairly general. Would it exceed standards? So what we look at, and the way that this section is organized, is you will see a total of, I'm going to look ahead, don't shift yet, 17 different impact statements. And what we'll be looking at, and what is looked at in the EIR, are two very different kinds of impacts for traffic, for transit. One is, what is the impact existing plus project? If we would take the traffic as it exists in the baseline, build out the entirety of the Baylands as it's proposed in each of these scenarios, and throw it onto the existing roadway system with just the internal roadways that are being proposed as part of this, what happens to our roadway system? And in the case of the Baylands, and in the case of this project, a very interesting thing happens. And that is, if nobody outside the Baylands builds anything ever again, you don't need to take Geneva Avenue and extend it to the freeway. You don't need to redo the two freeway interchanges that you have now. From a purely traffic capacity standpoint, and remember, that's what this section does. It analyzes physical capacity of the roadway system Not, do we like that much traffic? Is it comfortable having that much traffic? But what is the engineering capacity of these systems? You could actually take, build out the baylands, put onto the existing roadway system. On the flip side, when we look around the baylands, even if nothing were ever built on the baylands, none of these projects are approved, nothing gets built, and Daly City builds out all of their proposed projects, and San Francisco builds out all of their proposed projects, and everybody else in the Bay Area builds out their general plans. That interchange, or the two interchanges along the freeway, are going to be in very bad shape. They will go over capacity. Bayshore will be way, way over capacity, and that background traffic all by itself requires these major improvements. Now here is the rub as we look at traffic. So we look at the second part. Remember I said we look at existing plus project. The other thing that we do in traffic is we look at what happens with all of these projects, all of the development that's proposed in San Francisco, in Daly City, in South San Francisco, throughout the Bay Area, plus the Baylands, and we look at what is the cumulative effect of all of that traffic, and what does that what is the projects, the Baylands contribution to that major traffic increase. So you will see existing plus project, and you will see cumulative without project, cumulative with project. And so we'll look at, in the EIR, not only existing plus project, because traffic never occurs that way. That's one of those things, comply with the law, and it doesn't make any sense, but we had the judge tell the city of Sunnyvale, you must do it that way. So we have that analysis in there. The one to pay attention to is cumulative without and with project, because that will tell you 20 years from now the total traffic load and this project's contribution to that. Mitigation measures are then provided because there are significant impacts nearly throughout the system, along Bayshore, on the freeway, freeway interchanges, and the mitigation measures include freeway interchange improvements, intersection improvements, extending Geneva through, and all of those things. And the difficulty, or not difficulties, remember I said there's two major variables, and one variable is much more complex than I'm about to describe it. There's the development of the Baylands and the development of all the surrounding area, and together all of that is going to create this traffic. So how do we require this particular project, their timing of development, their timing of providing mitigation? And what the EIR says now is they're going to do their mitigation up front at the beginning. So that is the way that that is now set up. So let's go to the method of analysis. So as you take time looking at the document, or even just use this to read those 17 impact statements, what are the 17 different things we look at? That is the total of the analysis. Now the way that we do this analysis is there is a traffic model done by the city of San Francisco called the SF CHAMP Travel Demand Model. And I know CHAMP must stand for something because planners love acronyms. I don't know what CHAMP actually stands for though. But there is a traffic model, and that is the accepted model for this portion of the Bay Area to analyze traffic patterns. What happens when you add development to it? What happens when you change the mix of uses? What happens when you change the relationship of residential to employment generation, to where people live, to where they shop? And that gets measured in terms of daily person trips. How many people are moving from where to where in what are called traffic analysis zones? And to give you an idea how big they are, San Francisco is divided into just about 980 different zones. So you start analyzing zone by zone the movement between zones. And what this model does is it says for very short trips, people are much more likely to walk if it's really short, take a bicycle, use transit when you have transit stations at both ends, or take vehicles, drive. And so what the CHAMP model does is it actually measures increases in auto travel on the major roadway system, on the freeway system. It analyzes changes in transit patterns, how many people are trying to get onto BART and Caltrain and Samtrans, pedestrian patterns, how much travel is actually occurring walking, and bicycle patterns that account for where people are going and coming from. So the existing plus project, as I said, simply adds this development of the Baylands onto the existing, and the cumulative deals with all of those projects. The major ones that are analyzed in the EIR in terms of identifying where some of these things come from and some of the major improvements that we're assuming will be built in the future come out of requirements for Daly City's redevelopment program. They have required development in that redevelopment area to build certain things. San Francisco has required the development of Hunters Point and Candlestick Point to build certain facilities. And as part of a bi-county transportation study, which is a joint study of the city of Brisbane, San Mateo County, Daly City, San Francisco, looking at this corridor and the confluence of two counties and the cities and joint facilities, there are major facilities planned there. Candlestick Interchange, Sierra Point Interchange, Geneva Extension. So what we have assumed in the future without project, so these are the facilities that get built in the future, 20 years out, we are assuming will be in place. Why do we assume they'll be in place? Because those requirements have been already placed on existing development. So it seems, gee, if we do that and we assume that those are in place, then are we letting development within the Baylands off the hook for their share of the impact of needing those facilities? And the answer is no. That as part of the impact analysis, remember we look at the project's contribution to these regional facilities, but it really in some ways becomes unfair to say we're going to look at a system that assumes Candlestick Point builds out their land use approval from San Francisco, but somehow they never build any of the roadways that San Francisco allowed them to build. So the way that the cumulative with project and the way mitigation measures will work in relation to those is as part of your planning approval, as part of your ultimate approval as you look at this, you would put the very same requirements on the Baylands that San Francisco and Daly City have placed on their major developments. And then becomes an issue of each of the major developments and smaller developments pay for their share of the traffic that causes the need. So this is the list of projects. Bayshore at Tunnel, some improvements along Tunnel Avenue at Blanken, Bayshore at Blanken, the Bayshore at Sunnydale, widening of Harney Way going up into Candlestick Point. But the two major ones are extending Geneva through to the freeway and a new interchange at Geneva Avenue. Those are already required of the developments approved in other cities. Those will be requirements as we look at the EIR, and then the costs will be shared. You will also see in the traffic section a concept of level of service. This is how we determine what is traffic performance. And traffic performance is measured in terms of how long do you sit at an intersection. So level of service and traffic is measured at intersections. The reason it's measured at intersections is problems on a roadway, congestion, will occur at the intersection before it occurs on the roadway in between, because that's where all the conflicting movements are. Left turns, right turns, people having to stop, waiting for the other side to go. So what you will see in the traffic study is analysis of intersections, not capacity of how many lanes are on a street. And that's because the intersections will govern, we need this many through lanes, and that is what will govern the roadway in between. You will see this graded. And for better or worse, the traffic engineers use A, B, C, D, and unlike school, E and F. And the only one that you can translate to what we all remember from school is F is failing. But this is not a situation where, we want to be better than average, so we'll look at level of service B, and that's really good, but it would be even better for A. This looks at a series of how much time in an intersection can you afford to wait? Do people want to wait? How does the movement go through an intersection? But also remember to improve traffic. If we say, okay, we'd rather go with level of service C rather than D, how do you move that many vehicles through? And you end up with some hugely wide intersections. You see some of the pictures of European big roundabouts that have 8 lanes going around in big circles. That is what some of those intersections would take to move at relative free flow. So in terms of traffic, the basic standard that is used for most intersections in this area is level of service D, which is not like school, that's below average, and that means almost failing. The idea is at an intersection that's signalized, somebody would wait 35 to 55 seconds to make it through that intersection. At an unsignalized intersection, if you're at a stop sign, you're going to wait 25 to 35 seconds. And as you will see in this section, it's not possible even to get to that level of service in that 20 years from now, to get that, because picture left turns. If you've ever been at an intersection with 3 left turn lanes going, and it gets very confusing, and you finally get to a point you can't move that many cars through. But this is the basic way level of service and the traffic is identified. Now, the other thing that you'll notice is traffic is measured in the peak hour. Traffic is not measured, we got this many cars per day. Traffic impacts will be measured in the morning peak hour and in the evening peak hour, because as we all know, that's the time it gets congested. And it's really nice that at 2 a.m. you can go down a street and go through an intersection, and it works terrifically. But traffic does not average itself evenly over a day. So the impacts occur in those peak hours. And one of the things that occurs, and you will see here, is this identifies the number of trips that are generated by each of the 4 scenarios in the morning peak hour, and the AM peak, and the PM peak. And the part that took us by surprise, me as an environmental consultant, when I saw the outcome of the traffic model, is the greatest amount of traffic in the peak hour is created not by the project that has the most building area to it. It's created by the community prepared plan that has 7.7 million square feet of development as opposed to 12. And the reason for that, as we started looking at why does that occur, is because remember, one of the things that happens is where you have residential immediately adjacent to employment, people, some, will choose to live near their work. So they can ride a bicycle, they can walk, any other means. And within a development site that has a mix of uses, there will be just what's called internal capture. Not all trips leave the site. Not all of them get out onto the surrounding roadway system. So this is one of those places that the significance of an impact is not going to necessarily tell you good and bad, that you need to weigh value judgments against this. So what this is telling you is, by looking at mixed use, what happens when you add a mixture of employees in close proximity to jobs, you get fewer trips. So part of the trade-offs, part of the, as you look at this, there's going to be a whole other series of impacts related only to residential, but in this case, the mix of uses creates a lesser impact. And as I said, that has nothing to do with good or bad. It only has to do with this is how traffic reacts with that mix. Some key takeaways in terms of this section and things to look for as you read through traffic. I've mentioned these, that the major improvements, the Geneva extension, the interchanges, not needed under existing plus project, but as I said, it's required by CEQA, not reality in terms of what traffic will be like in the future. But that level of service standards get exceeded over a fairly large area when you take all the traffic that will be occurring. And then how do we deal with timing of mitigation? And in terms of the Geneva Avenue extension, things to think about: one, the timing and who is responsible for those improvements. But as you will see, is in the developer-sponsored plan, there are intersections along Geneva that are pretty closely spaced. So if you go into downtown San Francisco, we know blocks are not very long. If you look in more suburban areas on the big major streets, it's ideally on some streets a half a mile between intersections. And so when you start spacing intersections close to each other, if you analyze, as is done in the traffic modeling, the operation of an intersection that is, and it could look, it's doing just fine. 30 seconds of delay backs up traffic. How far? And if the intersections get too close, operations at one intersection can affect another, and they start mounting up. So the mitigation measure that is provided here is that the ultimate development of the developer-sponsored plan with those closely spaced intersections go through an analysis of how do you handle signal timing, how do you handle coordination of signals, how do you handle your traffic loading onto the individual intersections so that the operations at one intersection do not affect the next one. And that's a performance standard. Remember I mentioned at the beginning, performance standards that future development will be required to adhere to. That's one of them. The other issue that comes up is picture the Geneva extension under whatever alignment. There's now, you get off the road at Beatty, you get off the freeway and you go across the tunnel road. Well, when you build a major roadway that goes off an intersection in just about the same place, and you're going to build a grade separation so you can go up over the railroad, the key to that is no matter how development occurs, access to properties need to be kept in place. I'm being warned on timing. Thanks. So those are the issues you'll deal with in terms of traffic. Air quality. We look at air pollutant emissions during construction and project operation and health risks. So both amount of pollution and risk to public health. The significance criteria dealing with construction impacts as well as operational impacts, and looking at what are called, and I'll talk about some of these in a second, different types of air contaminants. And then basic methods of mitigation come down to dust control of construction projects, reducing emissions from construction equipment, energy consumption, reducing energy consumption, as well as odor controls, because that's discussed here also. The basic criteria that you will see in the significance thresholds come from the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. And I've never quite figured out how this works, but they actually measure gases in pounds per day. Pounds of gas, just difficult concept, and tons of gas per year. And so those are the threshold. If the project will result in more, significant; if it results in less. So these are the basic criteria that are used and the requirements in analyzing these pollutants. There is also a health risk assessment that looks at what is the risk to human health in terms of sensitive receptors, children at school, people in their homes, existing, future ones. This is measured, and this is probably the scariest measurement you're going to see anywhere in this document, is measured in cancer risk per million population. And there is actually a threshold that is a threshold of the Bay Area AQMD that is used to determine significant or not significant, and that is 10 per million. Chronic and acute impacts 1 per million, and then concentrations of real small dust particles, 2.5 microns, are also in there. In terms of health risks, none of the scenarios yield a significant impact. Greenhouse gas emissions, that is carbon dioxide, methane. Those are the gases that we hear so much about in terms of creating or exacerbating global climate change. And the basic threshold is per capita, per person. 4.6 metric tons of these gases annually. Tons of gas. That one's even more difficult, per person. But it's all measured in equivalents of carbon dioxide, because that's the main constituent. So gases that create much more, a ton of methane is weighed much more heavily. But that's the criterion. Because it's measured as per person, a larger project in some cases can yield less impact. Because again, remember what we saw in traffic. Basic measures or methods of mitigation, motor vehicle emissions. You can't control as a community what comes out of the tailpipe of automobiles, but you can deal with how do we reduce the amounts of traffic, reduce traffic generation, and then stationary source emissions, building energy use. This is what the greenhouse gas impacts look like. Remember, these are measured in tons per person. So the developer-sponsored plan ends up with less emissions per person. And per person in that case means number of residents plus the number of employees on site. And so that is the basic measurement there. As opposed to the community prepared plan, less development, but more per person. And the reasoning on that, and that also hit me initially as being counterintuitive, but for the same reason. The farther you remove jobs from housing, you now have motor vehicle emissions coming across that. And again, level of impact, significance versus less than significant, is not good or bad. It's simply, this is the way it is. So that good or bad is not what we're judging in an EIR. We're determining, is it above or below a threshold? And in this case, the single-use project, the non-residential project as opposed to a mixed-use project, yields a greater impact in terms of greenhouse gases. The last thing we'll talk about tonight in terms of the issues is noise. And in this case, we look at noise as we typically picture it, what we hear, both during construction as well as ongoing operations, vehicular traffic, and then the construction equipment. But we also look at, when we look at noise, vibration in the ground. And in particular, so we look at exposure of people to noise in excess of standards, ground-borne vibration, what would be the effect of Caltrain operations and exposure to people who will be, in the case of two scenarios, living on site or working on site, but also what is the impact of construction activities on historic buildings on the site. So construction, if pile driving is necessary, what would be the impacts on the historic roundhouse? Basic methods of mitigation that you'll see in here, building construction methods, so that sound insulation, and also isolating buildings from vibration, and performance standards related to pile driving if that's necessary. Noise has all sorts of terminology. It's measured in decibels, and that is, you'll see dB, you'll see dBA, because pure sound energy is not how human beings hear sound. We hear sound at certain pitches better than at others. So there's an A scale that weights it the same way people hear. You will see LEQ. That is sound averaged over a typical period of time, most often 1 hour. You will see things like L50, sound over a half an hour. You will see L10, sound over a tenth of an hour. And some of your noise standards are actually written that way in terms of this is the maximum noise level that you can have over half an hour. You can exceed that no more than half an hour, no more than 5 minutes. That's that L50, L10, L5. You will see L max. That one's probably the easiest. That's the maximum noise level. Instantaneous peak. You will also see averages of noise. DNL, which is a day-night noise level, that averages the sound energy of noise over an entire day, but says noise at night, noise at 2 a.m. is a whole lot more irritating than noise at 2 p.m. So therefore, noise at night is essentially weighted heavier than during the day, and it gives you an average over a daytime. CNEL, which is typically used for airports, averaged again over an entire day, and a penalty not only for nighttime noise, but also for noise during the evening hours. The other thing that you will see is this chart. I don't expect you to read that, but you will see a chart, nice colorful chart in the noise section, that lays out what noise levels are compatible with what types of land use. And this chart in various forms and colors and black and white and terminology is used statewide to identify noise levels and compatibility in relation to land uses. Things to remember in terms of how we determine significance of noise. I have a microphone here, but if two of you are standing talking to each other in the normal voice, you're going to be talking at about 65 decibels. A change in noise level. In a laboratory, carefully controlled conditions, somebody can perceive a change of 1 decibel. Under normal circumstances, people cannot perceive, outside of a laboratory, change less than 3 decibels. At 5 decibel change, from 50 to 55, 60 to 65, whatever that is, that becomes very noticeable. And so you will see a 3 decibel increase or 5 decibel increase used as a criteria for determining at what point does a change in noise become significant. 10 decibel increase in noise you would perceive as being twice as loud. And this is not a nice even scale. It's not like adding 1 and 1. I have 2 of these, I now have 2 more. If I have 50 of them and I add 50, I've got 100. When you look at noise, it's on a logarithmic scale. And so what that means is that, if I get this right, a change in 10 decibels in terms, I know I'm going to get seismicity mixed up here, but a change is 10 decibels is 10 times as great. It is not, from 10 to 20 is easy. That's not doubling. You'll hear it as doubling, but it's 10 times the sound energy. And so when you take a 50 decibel noise source and add a 50 decibel noise source, you come out with 53 because it's not even. So that also means that if you have a very loud noise, if you have ambient noise, existing noise that's 70 decibels in an area right next to the freeway, and you add a 60 decibel noise source or 50 decibel noise source, you will not perceive a change because the difference between 50 and 70 is so great. So that will help get you through the noise section. And in terms of noise, that is because of existing traffic, railroad, that is not one of the major issues. But one of the things that we did, because I recognize, and the EIR recognizes this, your community is outside of the 65 decibel noise level of San Francisco Airport. And so what the noise technicians would say is, no impact on the community. But when you get a jet coming overhead, you don't much care that for the next 20 minutes or for the rest of the night, there's not going to be any more jets coming overhead if you just got woke up. So there is a difference when you look at noise between that LMAX and what you perceive in terms of airport noise and the common threshold of the 65 decibels. And we do recognize that and discuss that, but in terms of the project, we're not affecting, it is not affecting noise in terms of airports. But there will be that acknowledgement that sometimes the numbers don't tell the whole story. So I'll quickly go through next steps, and then we'll talk about, I'll take questions. Next Tuesday night, what we'll be going through are public utilities, which will deal with water supply, public services, police, fire, schools, libraries, recreation, and energy use and energy impacts. On the 27th, we'll talk about hazards, hazardous materials, biological resources, and historic resources, and then a couple of the wrap-up issues under that CEQA requires we look at. That will conclude the presentation of what's in this document. In September, so well through the public review period, there will be a series of public meetings to take your comments on the draft DEIR. Following the close of the public review period on October 8th, written responses to all comments will be prepared, and that will become a final EIR. The draft EIR that you have now, all the comments that were received, all the written responses to the comments, and that package will then move on to the Planning Commission and ultimately the City Council to make a decision on the project, whatever that decision may be. But decisions on the project, approve, don't approve, modify, change, cannot be made until the final EIR is prepared at the end of the review period. So with that, if there's any questions, and we'll start in the back tonight and go forward, be glad to take them. And we have, we'll start with you, and then we'll come across that way, and there's a microphone showing up. There you are. Okay.
I guess I had a question in terms of you spoke about the assumed future roadway projects. What, if any, assumptions did you make about future changes to the transit system, whether Caltrain, BART? Particularly, I noticed you were identifying some things that were in the bi-county study, and I know there are also some transit system changes discussed in that study.
Yeah. In terms of transit, those major improvements were not assumed as part of the essentially future cumulative baseline. So it's those roadways that are required of those projects. That is part of what's called cumulative project, that is part of a series of existing, past, and reasonably foreseeable future projects. So no, we have not assumed increases in transit to say, oh look, everything's going to be great. And that's because we looked at what are the improvements that those projects are on the hook for, as opposed to paying a fair share to Muni to do something. And then there was a question right there. We lost the microphone. Oh, okay.
Sorry. Should I keep my place? Okay. I noticed that some of the analyses show that the community plan has what might be counterintuitive, a higher impact than the developer plan. But I also noticed that some of those are on a per person basis, and the developer plan has a higher number of persons. So how do we translate that into totals? Because if the total persons in the developer plan is significantly higher than the community plan, or no plan, then the total impact is different.
Yeah, and yeah, I'll do that. The question was, in terms of greenhouse gas, remember that's measured in terms of per capita. And when the number of people isn't even, how do we know, or how can you know what the total amount of emissions are? In the same way you'll see for air quality, total amount of emissions if all we have is per capita. And actually, if you look at the tables, you'll see that equation in there. So, or you just multiply backwards. If we know there are this many people and it's this many tons, just multiply back. But the way the thresholds are written are based on that per capita. And the reason that in terms of greenhouse gas it's per capita as opposed to total, like air quality, is the basic concept for air quality, or for greenhouse gas, is AB 32, SB 375, is allowing for some growth and recognizing population will continue to increase, but how do we roll back levels, the total level of development, how many people will be in the state, back to the amount of, and distributed over the same amount that was in, let me get this right, same amount in 1990 distributed over population in much later than that. So that's the reason that it's per capita, because the basic equation is coming from a statewide equation of this much emissions statewide, and how do you allocate it to individual projects. If everybody achieved that per capita, going back to Governor Schwarzenegger, the rollback that he wanted in his executive order, you would achieve that level. So if you want to look at the total amount, just do the multiplication. But in terms of air quality, that one really is per capita, because we're looking at the impact itself is not a project, same way traffic goes onto a roadway. The greenhouse gas impact is essentially a global, worldwide impact. So that's the reason it's measured each person's contribution. Any others? We're working our way from back to front, so we'll get there.
That last question assumes that if there are people living in the Baylands, they have a lower per person greenhouse level. But that's kind of assuming that they're not living somewhere. And wherever they are living, they're going to be having a greenhouse emission. So they're going to be lowering it. If they're living somewhere else, they're going to be lowering it there. So I don't think that's going to take into consideration.
Yeah, and that's, the model that's used, and the question is, if somebody's moving to the Baylands or a job is getting created on the Baylands, is that brand new to the region? Is it somebody moving their place of residence from here to there? What was their impact where they were before? And the way that the measurements work and the way that the accepted regional model works is within a project site, what is the outcome of that project? And it's not measured on, in terms of the Baylands, where did the people come from? What were their impact before? What is the change here? But you know, we're using the official way of comparing, and there are nuances that will occur, and that's one of them. Where were they living before? Where were they working before? And so that's one of the reasons I tell people, and will tell you, don't just look at the numbers. Don't just look at what these impacts are. You really need to think through, in case of sometimes a significant impact, what does that really mean? Or a less than significant impact, what does that really mean? And you'll see that when we talk about population, that exceeding the threshold may or may not be bad, because you have to take it in consideration of what would the situation be otherwise. Yes? Oh, we're trying different technology.
Oh, thank you. And could you help clarify what I'm looking at, your description of the method of mitigation on greenhouse gas emissions, the first one being the reduction of vehicle miles traveled through various means, and then your slide about projects trip generation, and showing I believe actual numbers of trips in the various alternatives. Yeah?
Yes.
So you were just discussing, an interpretation of the amount of emissions, but on an individual, as a global issue, but on an individual trip basis, are we to take these numbers as accurate? In other words, 5,800 trips or 5,300 trips or 4,800 trips, and how do they relate to the mitigation method of reducing vehicle miles traveled?
Sure. These are, yeah, you'll see in terms of some impacts. These are the numbers that come out when you look at what is traffic generation. This is before mitigation measures. So the other thing to remember in terms of mitigation measures, actually raised a really good point, and that is there are certain mitigation measures, things that we would call mitigation measures, that are part of a project. And so a project that includes, for example, an internal shuttle system that reduces traffic. The idea of, and you see this in the differences between the numbers, that has housing close to jobs, close to transit, it reduces the impact. That is part of the project. It's not credited as a mitigation measure. It's what we call internal, self-mitigating. There are project features that reduce impacts. Those features, when they're part of a project, are part of the impact and reducing the amount of impact of the project, but they don't get credit. Oh, look, you did this mitigation. Just think what it would have been without it. So these are the numbers that we looked at that came out as part of the traffic model before mitigation. So this is not measuring the effectiveness of transportation demand management, purposeful carpooling, facilitating carpooling, are some of the things you see in the Bay Area with employers being required to pay for transit passes and those kinds of things. This is also showing in terms of the mix of uses in the developer-sponsored plan, the mix of residential near employment, putting residential near major transit hub has a very different effect than otherwise. So if we had the residential farther from transit hub, if we had it separated, you're going to get different numbers. But this is a raw number that is the initial outcome of a traffic model, but it does take into account the internal capture of trips, how many trips essentially don't occur because you have close relationship between different kinds of land uses.
You identified Brisbane currently being outside the 65 decibel zone.
Right.
I believe it's the CNEL, community.
CNEL, correct.
Yeah, because decibel is single noise and community equivalency is everything and then balanced over the whole 24 hours.
Correct.
So we're outside the 65 CNEL zone.
You're outside the 65 CNEL zone, but as you all know, there are times that you will experience plane flying over that will go over 65. Yeah. Yes.
Oh, just to put the trip generation into context, at least for San Mateo County, you've seen a 10% increase in the amount of in-commuting out from outside of the county. We're over 60% of the people who work in the county live outside of the county. So there's a pretty good bet that if we're not providing housing on site, those people are going to be generating greenhouse gases from a long commute. I don't know if, is that dynamic comprehended in this modeling?
Yeah, and the way that it plays out, that's one of the reasons you'll see, and I had mentioned a significant impact with less development, because length of trip to work is longer. Yeah, and so, and one of the things you all know in the Bay Area is, people who are out in Pleasanton, Livermore get to see this much more clearly than you do, is how many people coming out over the Altamont Pass every day, because there are more jobs in the Bay Area than there are people living here, than there are workers living here. So the Bay Area as a region imports labor, as opposed to if you lived out in Tracy, their major, I say it this way, I'm going to get in trouble, I may never be able to go there again. Their major industry is exporting labor into the Bay Area, or one of their major industries. Export labor, import salaries. That's where they're getting. So that is where, and ultimately what a traffic model will do is balance out. If you have a trip, it starts somewhere and it goes somewhere. And what the model is doing is an equation of balancing the number of trips that are produced and the number of trips that are attracted over a region, and even in some cases outside a region where you have an internal imbalance. Then we'll come back over to this side.
The other,
Oh, we're going to come up front. I'm sorry.
the other neighboring projects, Fizz Valley, Candlestick, et cetera, are they described in some more detail in the appendix?
Yes, what you have is, and when I said the other CEQA impacts, Chapter 6, cumulative impacts, there will be a summary description of a series of 20-something other projects that are contributing to those cumulative impacts. And there was a question up here.
Oh, I get the little one. So I kind of need to ask this in two parts for clarification. So in the community preferred plan, we don't have residential included. But it's my understanding that the San Francisco portion is primarily housing, and I'm wondering if, but that's outside of our EIR. So does this study and all account from the people that might be living on the San Francisco side who are outside the scope but might still be walking to work because they're only, physically only 2 blocks from
Yeah.
their job?
Yes.
Or is that just like, are they just off the table and that housing is just off the table?
No, that's the reason that traffic uses, look at that, regional models. And so the model that's being used for traffic accounts for all of San Francisco, comes down into this area. And so it would account for travel right across the city limit, across Bayshore, and all of those things. So it does account for that residential that sits in those major San Francisco and Daly City projects.
But that seems to be contrary to what you said earlier, because if there's housing right across the street, you said it looks at within the project, and trips that go outside the project are different. And so it seems inconsistent to me what you're saying, and I'm just trying to understand it.
Right. Part of what to remember is the traffic modeling is looking over the entirety of San Francisco down into San Mateo County and the relationship of those two areas to the surrounding area. When you have a situation, as you do in the Bay Area, that there are more jobs than there are workers, you end up with different commute patterns than you would in an area where you have a different balance. So what the traffic model is measuring is the interaction not only of housing or not housing plus jobs within the Baylands, it's also measuring all the interactions between the relationship of existing and planned uses in San Francisco and Daly City. So yeah, there's tens of thousands of dwelling units being proposed that are part of what's analyzed in the model. But also what's in the model is future office buildings and other employment generating development occurring elsewhere in San Francisco. And so it all comes out, that's why it's looking at a regional balance, and it's difficult sometimes to say we're going to take a project in isolation. But there's residential over there, but it's moving traffic between all just about 1,000 traffic zones in San Francisco, the traffic zones coming down into San Mateo County, and looking at that balance of uses throughout that whole area, as well as outside the area.
I noticed in the transportation analysis of the peak hour, it's all peak hour analysis, but the entertainment variant, how does peak times during that get measured and impacted?
Right. The peak hour is the typical, that's the time traffic is worst. In the analysis of the entertainment variant, it is measuring a sold-out event, an evening sold-out event and adding it and figuring out how does traffic come. And different kinds of special event venues have very different kinds of traffic. So picture a football game, people show up a whole lot earlier than they do to a baseball game. And so it's measuring those kinds of patterns. How much of the traffic comes how early before a game? And so it measures that special event traffic, which in a typical special event will overwhelm any street system. And so the typical way of handling special event traffic is not to build more roadways. Basketball, you got 41 games a year. But it is to essentially shut down traffic lights and have traffic cops at individual intersections moving traffic manually. And so you see that in some major event venues moving traffic that way. And that is, you also have the temporary before the event, after the event, closing down traffic in other directions, moving traffic one way out, one way in before the event, one way out. So that kind of special event traffic management would be part of this also. But it's not the typical, we can't measure the typical peak hour and say that's, you know, the ongoing. Yes.
I have several questions, so if anyone else has a question in between, please don't hesitate to interrupt. Going to the one that you just spoke about, how do you account for the cost of that kind of mitigation for, you know, traffic police to do an event? Is that kind of cost accounted for in the mitigation measures?
The way that that's typically accounted for, and I've done worked on a few different special event venues, is one, the event actually hires the off-duty policeman, pays them overtime, or does it through the agency, and essentially pays for the overtime required to get those cops on the street, for the additional firemen that you may have there, paramedics. So that cost is just part of their operation of an event.
I see a hand back here.
I have lots of questions.
We're back.
Okay, so my next question is about noise. I have two questions there. One, are the intervals of silence also specified? Because you said something about the L50, the amount of noise that you have for a 30-minute period. And then is the interval of non-noise or not that 30 minutes also specified when you do the noise part of the thing? And let me ask the second question so you can answer it all at the same time. And what about long-term noise damage from exposure, like industrial hearing loss? Not just the perception, but what the exposure to 70 decibels over time does to human hearing, and is this taken into account? Because it does have a severe and profound effect over time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the first one in terms of measuring the time of silence, the way that the city's noise ordinance is written, and this is very typical of noise ordinances. Well, first I should say there's two different standards, noise standards that the city uses, which is also fairly typical. One deals with the compatibility of land uses with existing noise, and that's that colored chart that you saw there. That's what sits in the general plan. A residential use is compatible with this level of noise. An industrial use is compatible with this level of noise. Industrial being less sensitive than residential. The other standard deals with the creation of noise by a project. So what that standard actually sits in the municipal code. And the way that's written, as is typical, is, I can't remember the exact number, but a project may create this LEQ. So you would say 40 decibels, 50 decibels, that is the average noise carried out over an hour. That may be exceeded by 5 decibels for only this amount of time in an hour. and it may be exceeded by 10 decibels for a shorter period of time, shorter period of time, shorter period of time, so that there is also a standard for the L max. This is the loudest sound noise level, the instantaneous noise level that can be created. Now, in terms of industrial noise, you also have, and this is a reason to look at that regulatory section, regulatory setting. There are standards of the federal government and state government for exposure of workers to noise in the workplace. So those are the occupational health and safety, the OSHA standards. And what is being looked at in the EIR is the exposure of land uses, because that's where the city's decision-making is. What are the land uses appropriate in this area? What will we allow a land use in terms of noise to create that would affect a neighbor, as opposed to the regulation of noise within a building, which is handled at a state and federal level. You also have standards in terms of hotels, apartment buildings, multifamily, that say interior noise levels. So there's set an interior noise standard that says within a dwelling unit, multifamily dwelling unit, this is the maximum allowable noise level. And same for hotels. So those will get carried out because from the standpoint of typical construction will reduce noise 15 decibels or so with windows shut. So you can figure the interior noise level is 15 decibels or so less than the exterior. So to meet an interior standard sits under state law. They may need in some cases to build double pane windows, triple pane windows to design a project that it handles noise from the outside to the interior differently.
So just to clarify, let me clarify your answer. So to clarify, what I think I heard you say was on the L30, I mean on the L50, every 30 minutes, it would be every 30 minutes per hour?
No, it's not every 30 minutes. What it would say, let me,
Sorry, I just,
No,
you know,
that's-
it's kind of the whole noise issue is very important, especially in Brisbane where all noise gets amplified in odd ways because of the bowl-shaped, and we suffered horribly over pile driving noise in the past, multiple times, to the point where people were driven insane by it. So I think it's a big issue here.
so here's the test. Can he in fact find the noise standards that are supposed to be in here? That's section 4J. So the first part of this describes effects of noise. So if you talked about some of the issues of effects of noise, noise attenuation, and if we go to the regulatory setting, that's where the table was shown. That's figure 4J3. And then table 4J2, which is on page J12, shows the noise standards that are in the Brisbane Municipal Code. So those are the applicable city's noise standards. And basically what it says is that the duration of noise, how many minutes in an hour, and not on any time over a period of an hour, can noise reach that level. So in terms of single family, above the standard, you can go above that basic hour-long standard, 20 decibels above, for a maximum of 3 minutes within an hour. So take a look at page 4J12. That's the way it's laid out, but that's very typical, is to set a standard that allows for those L10s, Lmax, recognizing they're going to be higher than the average even over an hour.
I just wanted to clarify the scales so that I understand it when I'm looking at the table. But I believe you said that the L50 corresponds to a half an hour, and then the L25 corresponds to 10 minutes?
Quarter an hour. L10 would be 6 minutes.
Okay, so
The number, when you see L50, 50% of an hour. And L25,
it's a tenth of an hour.
Yeah,
So, okay,
yeah.
so it's, okay, now I understand that. And then on the greenhouse gas emissions impact, I was wondering if somewhere does it specify the assumptions about what percentage of the population is taking public transit? Because currently we
Yeah.
have an increasing level of participation in public transit, and I'm wondering, is that accounted for, and how is it carried forward in the computations?
Yeah, the number of people, percentage of trips that use public transit is actually shown in the traffic section. So one of the things that are shown in the traffic section, remember the model output is person trips. How many people move from here to there? And then it's allocated by mode of travel, and the technical term is mode split. But if you look in the traffic section for N, there'll be a table in there that tells you what percentage of these trips will occur in vehicles, transit, bicycles, so on. So that is one of the model outputs, but it's shown in the traffic section. Then you can use that to look at assumptions on transit. Now, one of the things to also keep in mind when you're looking at that, how many people are using transit, is one of the, I was going to say popular, but one of the things we need to be careful with is under CEQA, what we're required to do is analyze, and the phrase will be worst case. So we don't want to make a lot of assumptions that more people use transit, therefore we're just going to discount the amount of people that are going to be driving a car. So we need to be careful with that, because then the challenges occur on a document. Oh, you've kind of wished away your development by saying people ought to be taking transit. So we need to be a little bit careful with those assumptions, and the assumptions that are used need to be validated, may be a good word, but they need to be substantiated in terms of why is that a reasonable assumption? Why is the analysis based on a, not worst case, is the worst thing that could possibly happen, but what is reasonably a worst case outcome?
About that same traffic model, I had questions about that. And so my curiosity is, are the attributes of the model actually specified, and the assumptions that went into the model, and how the model is calculating? And also, when you talked about internal capture on traffic, is that a proven or assumed, and are those things clearly stated in here?
Yeah, and they're stated in there, and I think part of why there's a public review period is, as you read the document, do you feel comfortable that there's enough of an understanding of that, or do you want to see more of that described before there's a decision maker making a decision on it? In terms of the attributes of the model, there is some discussion of that. The question is do you think it's enough? Do you not think it's enough? So those can be added. In terms of the assumptions and the way that it works, there is also appendices. And so if part of what in your reading of the document say, gee, I'd really like to know more about how that model works, that's one of the written comments that would be helpful. We can then include additional information if you feel it's needed, is just what somebody wants to do. Got 1,200 pages here, more to read. But those kinds of things can be provided as part of.
And then I had one more question. I just wanted to know if the answer to this is going to be in there. But we know from data that the commercial footprint is about twice that, carbon footprint is about twice that of a residential carbon footprint. And I'm just wondering if you can tell me whether or not that's taken into account in the greenhouse emissions impacts, because it just seems unlikely from my superficial intuitive understanding of this, given that there are 12 million square feet of building in the DSP and only 7 million of commercial office space in the CPP. And so if that almost double the amount of commercial space at double the footprint would seem to indicate intuitively that you would get 4 times the commercial carbon footprint in the DSP than the CPP. So intuitively I would think that the DSP would have a higher greenhouse footprint even with additional trips generated.
Yeah, and that's why the use of thresholds is so critical in CEQA. And what is being measured and the applicable threshold is not the size of the carbon footprint. It is the amount of carbon dioxide equivalents, CO2e, carbon dioxide equivalents in terms of metric tons per person, because that's the measurement used statewide to get at the statewide goal. So, yeah, because we're looking at a cumulative impact rather than what is the carbon footprint of this project.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm assuming that when you have twice the commercial area, that's going to be twice as many employees. Those are bodies and therefore have a carbon emission per capita.
Yeah, those are the kinds of comments to give, and we'll respond to those. And
At this point, any further questions, please come up and ask. And this is the end of our,
Carolyn, I have one that's kind of important for everybody because it is like in our comments, can we question the assessment of the environmental settings and the characterization of the baseline? And that's kind of a question that everyone needs the answer to, not just me. Sorry to interrupt, but.
no, what I'll do is just describe the what's fair game for comments and not fair game for comments on an EIR, and it's the fair game, or what's not fair game is probably easier to say. Comments on this is a good project, this is a bad project, I like it, I don't like it, it's good because, it's bad because, that's not what the comment period is for. Right. Concerns over method of analysis, accuracy and adequacy of baseline methodology, asking for additional information, could you clarify this? Why carbon footprint as a, why not carbon footprint as a means of analysis as opposed to per capita? Why does this really occur in terms of counterintuitive? All of those are part of the discussion that goes on in CEQA. Did you look at this? Did you look at that? Had you considered this? If you considered this, then wouldn't the impact be that? Those are all fair game as part of what you would comment on in the public. And that is the very reason that there is a public review period. And that's also the reason that, given the importance of this decision to the community, the council has said the typical 45 days and the complexity of this project require a longer period of time.
Thank you.
So with that, I thank you all. And Tuesday we'll be back here talking about some public services and water supply. Thank you.